Imagine living in a place where you're part of a tiny minority, constantly facing barriers and feeling the weight of exclusion. What if some states in the US still have a long way to go when it comes to diversity and racial equality? Today, we're diving into the top 10 whitest states where Black people face unique challenges, from economic disparities to educational gaps, healthcare inequalities, and more. Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in these states? Let's find out. Number 10. Vermont. Vermont, the land of green hills and maple syrup, is a beautiful state that draws nature lovers from all over the world. But behind those idyllic views and charming small towns lies a racial issue that can't be ignored. Black people make up just about 1.6% of Vermont's population, which is one of the lowest percentages in the country. When you think about Vermont, diversity probably isn't the first thing that comes to mind, and unfortunately, the lack of racial representation can leave Black residents feeling like outsiders. In terms of economic disparities, Vermont has an average income gap where Black households earn significantly less than their white counterparts. According to recent data, the median household income for Black families in Vermont is around $30,000, while white families bring in roughly $60,000. That's a huge difference, and it's a direct reflection of the barriers to upward mobility that Black residents face in this state. This income gap can also translate into unequal access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities. For example, a report from the Vermont Department of Health noted that Black children in Vermont are more likely to be diagnosed with chronic conditions, and they experience higher rates of asthma and diabetes compared to white children. Vermont's education system, though highly regarded in the US, also struggles with racial disparities. Black students are disproportionately impacted by lower test scores, higher dropout rates, and less access to advanced coursework. In 2019, a study showed that the graduation rate for Black students in Vermont was 78%, compared to 90% for white students. This education gap leads to a cycle where Black residents have fewer opportunities to break into high-paying careers. And when you factor in healthcare inequalities, things get even more concerning. Black Vermonters are less likely to have access to primary care providers, and they face higher mortality rates for conditions like heart disease and stroke. Despite all these challenges, Vermont remains a place that many people are trying to change for the better. Grassroots movements, local advocacy, and community-based solutions are starting to make a difference. But it's clear that Vermont, for all its beauty, still has work to do when it comes to making Black residents feel welcome and supported. Number 9. New Hampshire. New Hampshire, the state of stunning mountain views, tranquil lakes, and some of the oldest and most prestigious schools in the country. It's a place many people dream of calling home, but for Black residents, the dream can be a little harder to achieve. New Hampshire's population is overwhelmingly white, with only about 1.5% of its population identifying as Black. It's one of the least racially diverse states in the US, and that's a big part of why Black Americans sometimes feel like they don't fit in. Let's talk numbers. New Hampshire's economy is generally considered strong, but it's not necessarily strong for Black residents. The median income for Black households in New Hampshire is $35,000, compared to a whopping $70,000 for white households. The state also has a noticeable racial pay gap. Black workers earn about 28% less than their white peers in similar job positions. This wage gap is especially stark in cities like Concord and Manchester, where most jobs in the healthcare, technology, and financial sectors are concentrated. And it's not just about income. It's about opportunities. New Hampshire has a reputation for favoring certain social networks, which means that Black residents often have to work twice as hard to break into industries that are predominantly white. The education system in New Hampshire doesn't necessarily level the playing field either. Black students in the state often face a higher likelihood of disciplinary action in schools. According to a 2020 report by the New Hampshire Department of Education, Black students were 3 times more likely to be suspended than their white counterparts. This creates a gap in educational attainment and often sets students up for fewer opportunities after graduation. Black students in New Hampshire are also more likely to attend underfunded schools, leading to poorer academic outcomes. On top of that, Black students in New Hampshire often score lower on standardized tests than their white peers, contributing to the cycle of educational inequity. Healthcare disparities are another glaring issue in New Hampshire. Black residents face barriers to healthcare access, often traveling farther to get medical care or being less likely to have health insurance. This is particularly evident in rural areas where healthcare facilities are already sparse. A 2021 report from the New Hampshire Health Equity Report found that Black New Hampshire residents experience higher rates of chronic illness, including diabetes and hypertension, and have lower life expectancy compared to their white neighbors. Even though New Hampshire has its challenges, it's important to note that there are many people in the state working toward change. Local organizations and activists are pushing for more inclusion in both the workforce and the community. But for now, New Hampshire remains a state where Black residents can feel like they're living in the shadows of a predominantly white population. Number 8. Maine. Maine, famous for its rugged coastline, lobster, and natural beauty, is also one of the least diverse states in the U.S. With only 1.3% of the population identifying as Black, it's no surprise that Maine's Black residents often report feeling like outsiders. The state's lack of racial diversity is a barrier to forming strong cultural connections, which can make it tough for Black individuals to settle and thrive. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the median household income for Black families in Maine is approximately $30,000, while for white families, it's about $57,000. This income inequality is not just about numbers, it's about real-life challenges, like not being able to afford a home or getting stuck in low-wage jobs. Maine's job market doesn't offer many opportunities for Black residents, particularly in rural areas where the job market is smaller and industries tend to be less diverse. This wage gap can also extend to health disparities, with Black Mainers facing higher rates of chronic illnesses such as high blood pressure, asthma, and diabetes. In fact, a 2020 study by the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention revealed that Black residents have a life expectancy that's 5 to 10 years shorter than their white counterparts. The education gap is just as concerning. In Maine, Black students are more likely to attend schools with fewer resources, which impacts their academic performance and future job prospects. Maine's racial achievement gap is reflected in the fact that only 60% of Black students graduate from high school, compared to 85% of white students. For Black students, the dream of pursuing higher education is often tempered by financial challenges, as they struggle with paying for college, particularly with a state that doesn't offer much financial aid for minority students. Maine's demographic makeup may be slow to change, but the state's growing awareness of its racial disparities could pave the way for a more inclusive future. Number 7. Alaska. Alaska is a state that often gets overlooked in conversations about race, but for Black Americans, the state offers a unique set of challenges. Known for its vast wilderness, icy landscapes, and rugged beauty, Alaska has a surprisingly small Black population, just 3.5%. It's a place where many people feel isolated from a sense of community, and the lack of racial diversity can lead to experiences of exclusion, particularly for Black residents, who make up a tiny fraction of the population. In Alaska, Black residents earn significantly less than their white counterparts. According to data from the U.S. Census Bureau, the median household income for Black Alaskans is around $45,000 compared to $75,000 for white households. That's a stark difference, and it reflects how Black Alaskans face not only lower-paying jobs but also a harder time moving up the economic ladder. The state's job market tends to be dominated by industries like oil, fishing, and construction, which have historically been less inclusive for Black workers. In fact, studies show that Black workers in Alaska are often paid less for the same jobs in these industries. Additionally, with fewer Black residents in leadership positions, there's often limited mentorship and fewer professional networks available for those looking to advance. When it comes to education, the racial achievement gap is just as significant. Black students in Alaska have been found to score lower on state tests than their white peers. A report by the Alaska Department of Education found that 40% of Black students were not proficient in math and reading, compared to only 25% of white students. This educational gap can be attributed to several factors, such as limited access to advanced coursework, disparities in school funding, and the higher likelihood that Black students attend schools in low-income areas with fewer resources. And this gap doesn't just disappear after high school, it carries over to higher education as well. Black students in Alaska often face higher dropout rates from colleges and universities, mostly due to financial strain and the lack of cultural support systems. Healthcare disparities are another major issue in Alaska. Black residents in the state are less likely to have access to healthcare, and they face higher rates of chronic diseases like diabetes and hypertension. In 2021, the Alaska Department of Health released a report showing that Black Alaskans had a 15% higher incidence of diabetes compared to white residents. Life expectancy is also lower, with Black residents living an average of 5 years less than white Alaskans. These health disparities are often compounded by geographical barriers, as many Black residents live in remote areas with limited access to medical care. Despite these challenges, Alaska is also home to a vibrant community of activists and organizations working toward change. While the state's demographic makeup is unlikely to change overnight, the growing awareness of these issues is helping to create opportunities for a more inclusive future. Number 6. South Dakota. South Dakota, a state known for the iconic Mount Rushmore, offers beautiful views, but for Black residents, it's a place where racial inequality is still very much alive. With just 2.1% of the population identifying as Black, South Dakota's racial diversity is minimal. That lack of diversity can create challenges for Black residents who may feel out of place, especially in rural communities where cultural differences are not as widely accepted. When we talk about income in South Dakota, the figures are stark. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, Black households in the state earn a median income of about $30,000, compared to $60,000 for white households. This income gap is a clear reflection of the limited opportunities for Black workers in the state, where employment is often concentrated in lower-paying industries like agriculture, hospitality, and service sectors. Black workers are also more likely to experience wage discrimination, making it harder for them to catch up to their white peers economically. This issue isn't just about wages, it affects housing as well. Black South Dakotans are more likely to rent than own, and when they do own property, they are often undervalued in terms of home prices. A report from the South Dakota Housing Development Authority found that Black homeowners are more likely to live in areas with lower property values than their white counterparts. The education system in South Dakota also demonstrates significant gaps in achievement. Black students often attend schools that are underfunded and have fewer resources than predominantly white schools. As of 2020, Black students in South Dakota had a graduation rate of 71%, compared to 84% for white students. This gap in education is not just about numbers, it's about the long-term effects on the job market. Students who don't graduate high school are more likely to end up in low-wage jobs, perpetuating the cycle of poverty. Black students in South Dakota are also more likely to be suspended or expelled, which further limits their educational opportunities. According to the U.S. Department of Education's Civil Rights Data Collection, Black students in South Dakota were 2.5 times more likely to face suspension than their white peers. Healthcare disparities in South Dakota are just as severe. Black South Dakotans experience higher rates of chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. The South Dakota Department of Health reports that Black residents have a life expectancy that is 6 years shorter than their white counterparts. One of the primary reasons for these disparities is limited access to healthcare in rural areas where many Black residents live. These residents often have to travel long distances to receive care, and without reliable transportation, many forego necessary treatments. While the road ahead may be long, these activists are determined to make South Dakota a more welcoming place for Black residents. Number 5. North Dakota. North Dakota, known for its vast prairies and bustling oil industry, is one of the whitest states in the U.S., with a Black population of just 2.3%. While the state has been growing in terms of economic development, the racial dynamics remain far behind, and Black residents often face challenges in finding community and feeling included. North Dakota shows a significant income gap between Black and white residents. The median income for Black households in the state is around $34,000, while white households earn a median income of $60,000. That's a stark contrast, and it highlights the lack of access to high-paying jobs for Black workers. North Dakota's economy is primarily driven by industries like agriculture, energy, and manufacturing, which tend to have lower diversity in leadership and workforce representation. According to the North Dakota Department of Labor and Human Rights, Black employees in the state are more likely to be employed in lower-wage service jobs and less likely to hold managerial or executive positions. The education system in North Dakota also contributes to racial disparities. Black students are less likely to have access to advanced courses or extracurricular activities, and they often attend schools that are underfunded and lacking in resources. According to a 2019 report by the North Dakota Department of Public Instruction, Black students have a graduation rate of just 70%, compared to 85% for their white peers. This gap in education creates long-term challenges for Black residents, limiting their ability to pursue higher-paying jobs and perpetuating the cycle of poverty. The lack of diversity in schools can also result in Black students feeling isolated or unsupported, which can have a negative impact on their academic performance. Healthcare is another area where North Dakota struggles with racial inequities. Black residents in the state face higher rates of chronic health conditions like diabetes, hypertension, and asthma. A 2020 study from the North Dakota Department of Health found that Black residents had a higher incidence of preventable diseases and were less likely to have regular access to healthcare services. Rural areas, where many Black residents live, have limited access to healthcare facilities, further exacerbating these health disparities. Number 4. West Virginia. West Virginia might be famous for its rolling Appalachian Mountains and a rich coal mining history. But when it comes to racial diversity, the state is largely homogeneous, with Black residents making up only 3.5% of the population. While it might not be the first state you think of when discussing racial disparities, West Virginia is home to a significant set of challenges for Black residents who often find themselves marginalized in both social and economic spheres. First off, let's talk about income inequality. In West Virginia, Black households make a median income of about $30,000, whereas their white counterparts are earning roughly $55,000 annually. That's a noticeable gap, and it has a direct effect on the quality of life for Black residents in the state. For Black workers, the employment market is more restrictive, with most jobs concentrated in industries like mining, healthcare, and retail, sectors where Black workers are underrepresented. Additionally, Black West Virginians have lower rates of home ownership compared to white residents, which further widens the wealth gap. Studies show that Black residents are less likely to be approved for home loans, even with similar credit scores and financial backgrounds. This lack of access to financial growth opportunities makes it harder for Black families to accumulate wealth and invest in their futures. Now, let's dig into the education gap. In West Virginia, Black students often attend underfunded schools, which leads to lower educational outcomes. The graduation rate for Black students in the state is about 75%, while white students graduate at a rate of 85%. This educational divide has long-term consequences, as high school graduates are more likely to face difficulties securing high-paying jobs. Moreover, Black students in West Virginia are disproportionately disciplined compared to their white peers. A report from the West Virginia Department of Education found that Black students were twice as likely to be suspended or expelled for disciplinary reasons, which can severely disrupt their education. Healthcare is another area where West Virginia shows clear disparities. Black residents are more likely to suffer from chronic health conditions like hypertension, diabetes, and heart disease. The state's healthcare infrastructure, particularly in rural areas, is underfunded and inaccessible to many residents. In fact, a 2018 report by the West Virginia Health Department revealed that Black residents in the state had a 25% higher risk of premature death due to preventable health conditions than their white counterparts. West Virginia may be a beautiful state in many ways, but it's clear there's a long road ahead before it becomes a place where all residents, regardless of race, feel equally included. Number 3. Wyoming. Wyoming, known for its stunning national parks, wide open spaces, and cowboy culture, is one of the least racially diverse states in the U.S. Black people make up just 1.2% of the population, and their experiences here are often shaped by the state's overwhelming white majority. The challenge in Wyoming isn't just about the numbers, it's about the systemic barriers that Black residents face when it comes to employment, education, and healthcare. Wyoming's economy, which is driven by industries like energy, agriculture, and tourism, has been slow to diversify in terms of racial representation. Black workers in Wyoming are often stuck in lower-paying, less stable jobs compared to their white counterparts. The median household income for Black families in Wyoming is about $34,000, while white families earn a median of $60,000 annually. These disparities reflect deeper issues of discrimination, both in hiring and within workplace dynamics. Studies show that Black workers are often excluded from higher-paying managerial roles and face racial bias in job opportunities. Education in Wyoming also exhibits a noticeable gap. Black students in Wyoming are more likely to attend schools in underserved areas, which impacts their ability to succeed academically. According to the Wyoming Department of Education, Black students have a graduation rate of just 68%, compared to 85% for white students. Additionally, Black students in Wyoming are more likely to be suspended or expelled for behavioral issues, a trend that is seen across many of the state's schools. With fewer educational resources and less support, Black students face an uphill battle when it comes to competing for college scholarships and internships. When it comes to healthcare, Wyoming's rural nature makes access to quality care more difficult for everyone, but particularly for Black residents. A 2020 study by the Wyoming Department of Health found that Black residents were 30% more likely to report unmet medical needs due to transportation issues or lack of insurance. Additionally, Black Wyomingites face higher rates of chronic illnesses such as diabetes and hypertension, largely due to limited access to healthcare and preventative care services. The state also struggles with healthcare workforce shortages, meaning there are fewer healthcare providers available to meet the needs of residents. Number 2. Idaho. Idaho, home to beautiful mountains, national forests, and a booming tech industry, might seem like an idyllic place to live, but for Black Americans, it's a state that poses some serious challenges. With Black people making up just about 1.1% of the state's population, Idaho's lack of racial diversity is felt keenly by those who do live there. Black residents often report feelings of isolation and exclusion, particularly in rural areas where their presence is even more limited. Economically, Idaho shows significant disparities between Black and white residents. The median income for Black households in Idaho is $30,000, while the median income for white households is nearly $55,000. This economic gap is reflective of both the low-wage industries that many Black workers are employed in and the racial bias that persists in hiring practices. According to a report from the Idaho Department of Labor, Black job applicants are less likely to be called back for interviews or offered positions compared to their white counterparts, even when they have similar qualifications. This means that despite being qualified, many Black residents are left with fewer job opportunities and lower wages. The education system in Idaho also reflects racial inequities. Black students in Idaho have lower graduation rates and standardized test scores compared to their white peers. The 2019 Idaho State Board of Education report found that the graduation rate for Black students in the state was around 70%, while white students had a graduation rate of 85%. Black students are also more likely to be suspended or expelled, a trend that disproportionately affects minority students in many parts of the country. With fewer educational resources and less support, Black students in Idaho face an uphill battle when it comes to preparing for college or entering the workforce. In terms of healthcare, Black Idahoans face disparities in access to care and health outcomes. A 2021 report from the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare showed that Black residents had a higher incidence of chronic conditions like hypertension and diabetes, and they are more likely to be uninsured. Access to healthcare is especially difficult in rural areas, where medical services are limited. Black residents often face long waits for appointments or have to travel long distances to receive adequate care. While Idaho may have challenges when it comes to racial equity, there are efforts underway to bring attention to these issues and create change. activists, and community organizations are working to increase diversity and inclusion. And there's hope that the state will continue to evolve toward a more just and equal future for all of its residents. Number 1. Montana. Montana is one of the least diverse states in the U.S., with Black people making up only 0.6% of the population. The state is known for its stunning natural beauty, with vast prairies, rugged mountains, and wide open spaces. However, it's also a place where racial disparities run deep, particularly for Black residents who often struggle to feel like they belong. Montana's income disparity is striking. Black households in the state earn a median income of just $25,000 annually, while white households earn around $55,000. That's a massive income gap that reflects the broader systemic inequalities that Black residents face in both employment and wealth-building opportunities. Montana's job market is largely centered around agriculture, mining, and energy, sectors where racial diversity is minimal. Black workers are underrepresented in high-paying skilled professions, and this lack of representation limits economic mobility for many Black residents. The education gap in Montana is just as concerning. Black students in Montana are more likely to attend schools in underfunded areas, leading to a lower quality of education. The graduation rate for Black students in Montana is only 65% compared to 85% for white students. Additionally, Black students are more likely to face disciplinary actions, like suspension or expulsion, which further disrupts their education. This lack of educational opportunities contributes to long-term disparities in employment and income. Healthcare is another area where Black residents in Montana face challenges. Due to the state's rural nature, access to healthcare is limited, and this disproportionately affects Black residents. According to a 2020 report from the Montana Department of Public Health, Black residents in the state have a significantly higher rate of chronic diseases like diabetes, hypertension, and heart disease. Additionally, Black Montanans face barriers to accessing medical care, with fewer healthcare providers in rural areas and limited availability of culturally competent care. Despite these disparities, Montana has a growing community of activists and organizations pushing for racial equity and inclusion. The state may be small in terms of its Black population, but the efforts to improve conditions for Black residents are gaining momentum. With continued advocacy and education, there is hope that Montana can eventually become a state where racial equity is more than just a distant goal.